Nathan was doing really well in his job at the nursery, and he was well liked, which showed up in big tips from satisfied customers. It seemed they appreciated his enthusiastic attitude as he delivered plants, soil, and other garden paraphernalia to their cars. I was about working with Barry on a script that had been written by Art Linson, a Hollywood producer responsible for many successful films, including Fight Club and The Untouchables. This script was based on his book about a Hollywood producer who was having a rough time trying to get his new film made. I'm sure it was autobiographical. Barry was going to direct the film, and Art had given him permission to make a few changes here and there, in line with Barry's style of dialogue. Robert De Niro was to star in the film. While we were in the middle of this script, Barry suddenly said he'd been thinking of writing a musical theatre version of Dinah, the first movie he ever directed. In fact, he'd been talking to Sheryl Crow about writing the music. This was a surprise, but as soon as the Art Linson script was finished, we started putting a play together based on Dinah. I was a bit hesitant at first, but why wouldn't it work? Since another Baltimore native, director John Waters, had done the very same thing when he adapted his film of Hairspray into a very successful musical. I enjoyed the process, and together with Sheryl Crow's music, yet to be written, I didn't doubt that it could also be a success. Since I'd appeared in Light Up the Sky a few months previously, I realised just how much I enjoyed acting in theatre. I found out there was a theatre company in Newtown, not far from where I lived, and they were holding auditions for several characters in Fuddy Mears, a wacky play by David Lindsay Abaire. I read for the role of Gertie, the matriarch of a dysfunctional family who'd recently had a stroke, and she has difficulty pronouncing her words correctly. For instance, Fuddy Mears was her version of Funny Mirrors. My dialogue was essentially mispronounced words, which was an interesting experience for me. The play was directed by Mary Poyle, a fellow Brit who hailed from London and had lived in Connecticut with her family for many years. We got along very well, and I liked her sense of humour. I also appreciated that she'd chosen such an off-the-wall play to direct, and, of course, that she'd chosen me to play the role of such a fascinating character. As well as working at the nursery, Nathan also spent time with his friend Tony, who lived in Sandy Hook. I don't think I can go any further mentioning this part of Newtown without talking about the horrific tragedy that took place there in December of 2012. It was 6 years after I'd lived in Newtown when 20-year-old Adam Lanza shot and killed 26 people at Sandy Hook Elementary School. 20 of the victims were children between the ages of 6 and 7 years old, and the other 6 were adult staff members. Earlier that day, before driving to the school, Lanza shot and killed his mother at their Newtown home. Adam Lanza committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. At that time, it was the deadliest mass shooting at an elementary school in US history. I thought of Tony, who by this time had a 6-year-old boy, and I prayed that his son was safe. Thankfully he was, although who knows the extent of the psychological damage to the children who survived such horror. Now, back in 2004, changes were on the horizon. By this time, Nathan had lived with me for 6 months, and the plan was that he'd go back to Vegas when his girlfriend gave birth to their baby. He was very excited at the prospect of being a father and bought a couple of cute t-shirts for the baby boy. Even though everything in the garden seemed very rosy, that wasn't the case at all. Nathan had made friends with a woman at the nursery who was in her mid-20s, and actually had a 10-year-old boy. It turned out that she also had a stash of marijuana. She often dropped Nathan home after work when he didn't feel like riding his bike, although it seemed there was an ulterior motive, smoking weed together being one of them. I'd recently smelled it on his clothes, but when I asked him, he denied it. Well, since I couldn't find any trace of it in his stuff at home, I figured it was just a one-off. I can hear what you're saying. Marie, how can you be so naive? One day he arrived home early and told me he'd been fired, and so had the woman. Apparently a week earlier, they were discovered smoking marijuana at work. They'd both been given a caution, which they'd ignored. Nathan told me he didn't care about the job because he wasn't really enjoying it anyway. Shortly after this, he received distressing news. His girlfriend in Las Vegas called to say that she'd lost the baby. She was naturally devastated, and so was Nathan. "What should I do?" he said. I told him he needed to go back to Vegas to be with her. "She needs you now more than ever, Nathan." I was aware that she lived with her parents, and they weren't particularly fond of Nathan. But I told him it was the right thing for him to do, regardless of their feelings towards him. "All right, but I'm going to come back." Within a couple of weeks, he was back in Vegas, but wasn't successful in his attempt to see his girlfriend. I tried to get more information out of him, but his phone call was brief, and I could tell he was not doing great. "I should have stayed with you, Marie," he said. Then he quickly hung up. I didn't hear from Nathan again until over a year later, and it was a collect call from a prison in Arizona. In the meantime, I appeared in a couple more plays, separate tables at the Westport Community Theatre, playing the role of Mrs. Relton Bell, a rather domineering society lady, which was fun. Then I was in an Agatha Christie play, Black Coffee, at a theatre in New Canaan, in the role of a doctor. Both roles were quite different, but at least the dialogue was straightforward, and no mispronounced words. I worked with Barry intermittently, but I never knew when he was going to call me, although I was always ready. I knew when I moved into the cottage in Newtown that the owners were putting the property on the market, but it took 2 years before they had a buyer. I was given 3 months' notice, which gave me enough time to find a very interesting one-bedroom apartment in a converted 1890s Victorian mansion in the village of Brewster, New York. It was on the border of Connecticut and walking distance to the train station, so I could easily pop into New York. The mansion and huge garden were big attractions at Halloween. For several years, a group of mansion residents and neighbours organised the most spectacular and pretty outrageous ghostly display with equally bizarre and scary sound effects. They started planning it in September and put so much work into it. I'd never seen anything like it. It was amazing. It was shown on TV and people came from near and far to experience this gruesome but fun Halloween spectacle. Since I just moved into the mansion, my only job was to dress up like a witch and hand out candy to those brave kids who managed to make it to the door. A few months later, I received a call, yes, from a prison in Arizona, asking if I'd accept a collect call from Nathan. Of course I did. "Hi, Marie," he said rather sheepishly. "Oh, why are you in prison, Nathan?" "I'm messed up." He didn't go into any more details, but was quick to tell me he'd been in a fight before he went to prison and had been shot in the ankle. "Oh my God, Nathan, are you able to walk? Is there permanent damage?" "I'm okay, but you know, Marie, it really hurt." Do you think? I said, I imagine it did. It was a bullet, wasn't it? He thought that was funny. Then he said, I'm going to be in for 3 months. I'm sorry to ask you, Marie, but can you deposit some money into my prison account so that I can buy toothpaste and stuff? I asked him if $20 was enough. Oh, yeah, that'd be great, he said. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Marie. I never want to disappoint you. I love you. Then the call ended. I was a bit stunned and, yes, disappointed. But I suppose I realized when he returned to live with his mother in Vegas 6 years earlier that his path was set. I thought it would have been so different if he'd lived with me, but maybe it wouldn't. It just wasn't meant to be. Next time, back to Los Angeles and more stars. Thanks for listening.